the Ottoman army that contemporary sources numbered at over 100,000 combat troops. According to both Habsburg and Muslim chronicles, Vienna should have fallen in weeks. Instead, what happened on September 12, 1683, the largest cavalry charge in European history, would reverse 300 years of Ottoman expansion in a single afternoon. Think about those numbers. Historical records document the impossible. A garrison of no more than 16,000 fighting men facing an Ottoman force that chroniclers estimated between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers. The defenders were starving, diseased, exhausted. Their walls had been breached in multiple places by sophisticated Ottoman mining. By every military calculation of the era, Vienna was already lost. By the end of this video, you'll understand how historical sources document one of warfare's most dramatic reversals, and why this single battle permanently ended Ottoman expansion into Europe. Here's what I'm going to reveal. First, the underground war documented in engineering reports. How Ottoman sappers came within minutes of literally blowing the city into the air. Second, the tactical deception recorded in both Christian and Muslim accounts that allowed 18,000 cavalry to achieve complete surprise. And third, the moment when the Grand Vizier, according to Turkish chronicles themselves, realized he'd been outmaneuvered by a Polish king. But think about this. How did defenders on the edge of starvation suddenly find strength to hold one more day? Why did Kara Mustafa, one of the Ottoman Empire's most powerful generals, refuse to abandon a siege even as a massive relief army descended on his position? How could 18,000 horsemen charge downhill for over 2 miles and maintain formation? What made the invincible Janissaries, elite troops who'd conquered half the known world, flee in absolute panic? And here's the question historians still debate. If Vienna had fallen, would there even be a Western Europe as we know it today? To understand how 60 days of desperate defense and 12 hours of brutal combat changed European history, we need to return to the spring of 1683, when the largest Ottoman army ever assembled began its march toward the Golden Apple. 30 years before Vienna's walls trembled, the Ottoman Empire was dying from within. Palace intrigues had paralyzed decision-making. The period Ottoman historians called the Sultanate of Women, when imperial mothers and concubines wielded power from behind screens, had weakened central authority to the point of collapse. Provincial governors ignored Constantinople's orders. Corruption consumed tax revenues before they reached the treasury. The military machine that had terrified Europe for 2 centuries was rusting from administrative rot. Then came the Köprülü family. When Köprülü Mehmed Pasha became Grand Vizier in 1656, he moved with surgical brutality. Ottoman administrative records document his purge. Corrupt officials executed, rebellious governors replaced. The Sultan's authority restored through systematic violence. He rebuilt what decay had destroyed, creating a professional bureaucracy that would outlast him by decades. By 1683, the Ottoman Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent in Europe. Sultan Mehmed IV, nicknamed the Hunter for his obsession with the chase, presided over an empire spanning 3 continents. But while Mehmed hunted deer in Thrace, real power lay with his Grand Vizier, Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha, who inherited the Köprülü system and possessed ambitions that would dwarf his predecessors. The opportunity he'd been waiting for arrived from an unexpected source: Hungarian rebels. Emperor Leopold I of Austria had pursued aggressive counter-Reformation policies that alienated Protestant Hungarian nobility. Habsburg records document his systematic pressure. Forced conversions, Jesuit missions backed by imperial troops, the gradual erosion of Hungarian autonomy. When Imre Thököly led Protestant nobles into open revolt in 1678. He did something that would reshape European history. He asked the Ottomans for protection. Thököly's alliance provided Kara Mustafa with a legal pretext that Ottoman jurists could defend. The Sultan wasn't invading Christian lands unprovoked. He was honoring a vassal's request for aid. More importantly, the alliance created a strategic opening. With Thököly controlling Upper Hungary, Ottoman forces could bypass the network of frontier fortresses that had stopped previous invasions. The road to Vienna lay open. Ottoman chronicles record that Kara Mustafa called Vienna the Kizil Elma, the golden apple, the ultimate prize of westward expansion. Control Vienna. Control the Danube River corridor into Germany and beyond. Capture the Habsburg capital, and Central Europe would fall like ripe fruit. But here's where European politics added a layer of deadly complexity. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, viewed the Ottoman threat as a convenient distraction. While Habsburg armies fought in the east, French forces could seize territory in the Rhineland and Spanish Netherlands without Austrian interference. French diplomatic correspondence reveals this calculated encouragement of Ottoman aggression, a cynical balance of power strategy that put Vienna in a vice between two enemies. The Habsburg Empire faced military disaster on two fronts, with resources for neither. By March 1683, Kara Mustafa had assembled the largest Ottoman army ever to march into Europe. Contemporary sources describe columns stretching for miles, supply trains numbering in the thousands, artillery pieces so numerous that their transport required entire forests worth of timber for gun carriages. Vienna would either open its gates in submission or burn to ash like Athens before it. But the Grand Vizier made one critical miscalculation. He assumed Vienna stood alone, while Ottoman columns marched west. Desperate diplomacy was unfolding in Rome. The man who would save Christian Europe wasn't a warrior. He was a 73-year-old pope who'd never held a sword. But Pope Innocent XI possessed something more powerful than military skill: an obsession with stopping Ottoman expansion and the personal fortune to fund resistance. Benedetto Odescalchi had become pope in 1676 with a singular mission. Papal correspondence reveals his fixation on the Ottoman threat, which he viewed as an existential danger to Christendom itself. While other European monarchs pursued narrow dynastic interests, Innocent saw the larger picture. If the Ottomans took Vienna, the entire structure of Christian Europe would collapse. The problem was that Christian Europe couldn't stand each other. The 30 Years' War had ended in 1648, but its religious hatreds still burned. Protestant German princes distrusted the Catholic Habsburgs almost as much as they feared the Muslim Ottomans. Diplomatic records document the depth of this division. Saxon and Bavarian courts spent more time plotting against Vienna than preparing for Turkish invasion. The wounds of religious war ran too deep for easy healing. Pope Innocent did something unprecedented. He convinced Protestant princes that the Ottoman threat transcended religious division. Papal financial records document his personal expenditure. Over 1.5 million scudi from his own fortune, equivalent to roughly $50 million today, spent funding the coalition. Money for Protestant German armies. Money for Catholic Habsburg forces. Money for anyone who would fight. His secret weapon was a Capuchin friar named Marco d'Aviano. Contemporary accounts describe Marco as possessing an almost supernatural ability to inspire men. He moved through military camps like a living flame, celebrating Mass before battles, hearing confessions in trenches, turning religious duty into martial fever. Beatification documents compiled after his death record dozens of testimonies from soldiers who credited him with miraculous interventions. Whether divine or simply charismatic, Marco da Viano became the spiritual glue holding the coalition together. But the critical piece was Poland. King John III Sobieski of Poland had fought the Ottomans before. The Treaty of Żurawno in 1676 had established an uneasy peace between Poland, Lithuania, and the Ottoman Empire after years of devastating border warfare. Polish diplomatic records reveal Sobieski's calculation. Helping Vienna wasn't charity, but strategic necessity. If the Habsburgs fell, Poland would face the full weight of Ottoman power alone. On March 31st, 1683, Sobieski signed the Treaty of Warsaw with Emperor Leopold. Poland committed to Vienna's defense in exchange for Habsburg support against future threats. The alliance that would save Europe was sealed in ink and sealed with calculation. Throughout the summer, the impossible coalition took shape. Maximilian II Emmanuel of Bavaria brought 11,000 troops. John George III of Saxony contributed 9,000. Smaller German states added contingents of hundreds or thousands, each prince contributing what he could. Papal diplomatic efforts had achieved what seemed impossible, uniting Protestant and Catholic princes who'd fought each other for 30 years under a single banner against a common enemy. The question was timing. The Treaty of Warsaw committed Poland to aid, but assembling and marching an army takes time. Contemporary military logistics suggest that moving 20,000 heavy cavalry from Poland to Vienna would require at least 6 weeks, probably longer. Vienna would have to survive on its own until relief arrived. By the time Vienna's church bells rang in terror on July 14th, the coalition was forming. But it would take time. Time Vienna didn't have. The race was on. Would relief arrive before the city walls collapsed? As diplomats drafted treaties in Rome, a different kind of calculation was unfolding in the mind of the Grand Vizier. The man who would lead 120,000 soldiers to Vienna had never commanded a major battle. But he'd mastered something more dangerous: palace politics. Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha was born a Christian in the Anatolian town of Merzifon around 1634. Ottoman administrative records document his recruitment through the Devshirme system, the child levy that took Christian boys, converted them to Islam, and trained them for imperial service. It was a system that had produced some of the empire's greatest leaders, turning slaves into sultans' right hands through merit and ruthlessness. Kara Mustafa rose not through battlefield glory, but through bureaucratic skill. He married into the powerful Köprülü family, the dynasty of Grand Viziers who had restored Ottoman power. Palace records show his progression: provincial governor, then increasingly important administrative posts, each step bringing him closer to the pinnacle of power. In November 1676, Sultan Mehmed IV appointed him Grand Vizier, making him the second most powerful man in an empire spanning 3 continents. Contemporary European observers described him as ambitious, stubborn, and arrogant. Habsburg diplomatic reports paint a picture of a man whose confidence in his own judgment bordered on dangerous overconfidence. Ottoman sources, written after his fall, blamed him for excessive pride. What both sides agree on is this: Kara Mustafa believed himself destined for greatness, and Vienna would be his legacy. When the Grand Vizier's army appeared before Vienna's walls on July 14, 1683, Ottoman military chronicles document a critical debate. The question that would determine everything: storm the city immediately or conduct a methodical siege. Option 1: immediate assault. contemporary Ottoman military doctrine favored overwhelming force applied quickly. Hurl the Janissaries at the walls in wave after wave, accepting horrific casualties but taking the city in days. The downside was obvious. Assault meant destruction. Vienna would burn, its wealth consumed in the fighting, its population scattered or enslaved. Nothing would remain to plunder. Option 2. Siege warfare. Surround the city, cut it off from supplies, use sophisticated mining techniques to collapse the walls from below. Lower casualties among Ottoman forces, and critically, the city would be taken intact. Every building preserved, every treasure captured, every citizen available for ransom or slavery. The wealth of the Habsburg capital would flow into Ottoman coffers. Kara Mustafa chose siege. We cannot know the Grand Vizier's true thoughts. But both contemporary Ottoman critics and European observers attributed his choice to personal greed. The share of plunder that would flow to the Grand Vizier from an intact Vienna defied calculation. Habsburg Vienna was one of Europe's wealthiest cities, a trade hub where gold accumulated like water behind a dam. Contemporary sources suggest the expected wealth numbered in the millions, enough to secure Kara Mustafa's political position for life. Whether motivated by greed or military calculation, the decision gave Vienna 60 days to organize relief. Every day spent digging trenches and tunneling under walls was a day the coalition had to assemble. What seemed like prudent strategy was actually a ticking clock counting down to disaster. Here's where Kara Mustafa made his first fatal error. His entire career had been administrative, not military. Ottoman records show no major battle commands in his background, no experience leading armies in desperate field combat. He understood logistics, supply chains, bureaucratic maneuvering. What he'd never learned was the warrior's instinct for when to risk everything on a single throw. A more experienced commander would have sensed the danger. Intelligence reports reaching the Ottoman camp documented coalition preparations. By late July, Ottoman scouts knew relief was coming. Military logic screamed, "Take Vienna quickly, or abandon the siege to fight the relief army on favorable ground." Kara Mustafa refused both options. He would take Vienna his way, methodically, profitably, and deal with any relief force when it arrived. Staring at Vienna's walls on July 14th, the Grand Vizier saw gold. He should have seen a trap. Because while he prepared his sappers for a slow, methodical siege, another commander was preparing for the campaign of his life. If Kara Mustafa was a political creature thrust into military command, his opponent was the opposite. A warrior king who'd spent 20 years mastering the art of cavalry warfare. The man who would save Vienna had already beaten the Ottomans once. At Khotin on November 11th, 1673, outnumbered roughly 3-1, John III Sobieski had turned a Turkish invasion into a rout. 10 years later, at age 54, he was about to do it again. Born August 17th, 1629 at Olesko Castle, Jan Sobieski grew up in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's warrior nobility. Polish biographies document his education in Krakow, his travels through Western Europe studying military arts in France and the Netherlands, his early campaigns fighting Tatars, Cossacks, and Swedes. The Szlachta, Poland's noble class, lived by a code that mixed Christian duty with martial prowess. To be a Polish noble meant being ready to mount a horse and fight at any moment. But Sobieski wasn't just another noble warrior. He was a tactical genius who understood cavalry warfare at an almost instinctive level. The victory at Khotin established his reputation. Polish military chronicles record the battle's impossible odds. Approximately 40,000 Polish troops facing Ottoman forces that contemporary accounts numbered at over 100,000. Historians debate the exact numbers, as medieval sources typically inflated enemy strength. But all agree the Poles were badly outnumbered. Sobieski's victory wasn't luck, but brilliant use of terrain, timing, and the devastating shock power of Polish heavy cavalry. That victory made him king. When the Polish throne became vacant in 1674, the Szlachta elected Sobieski based on battlefield success. Polish constitutional records document the election. Nobles chose a warrior king who'd proven he could defend the Commonwealth against its greatest threats. At 44 years old, John III took a crown earned in blood and bronze. For the next 9 years, Sobieski studied Ottoman tactics obsessively. He knew their strengths: flexible combined arms doctrine, excellent cavalry, superb siege engineering. He knew their weaknesses: tendency toward overconfidence, rigid hierarchies that slowed battlefield adaptation, vulnerability to coordinated shock charges that shattered their formations before flexibility could respond. Most importantly, Sobieski understood the winged hussars. Polish military traditions had perfected heavy cavalry shock tactics over more than a century. The Husaria, Poland's elite mounted warriors, were drawn from the nobility itself. Each hussar was a Torzis, a companion to the king, who raised his own retinue of armed servants and fought in equipment he provided himself. Contemporary accounts describe their appearance as almost supernatural. Polished armor kept bright rather than blackened. Leopard and tiger skins worn over shoulders. And the famous wings, wooden frames festooned with eagle feathers that created a distinctive rushing sound when charging. The hussar's primary weapon was the kopia, a lance reaching up to 20 feet in length. To make such a weapon manageable, Polish craftsmen hollowed out fir wood centers and glued them back together, creating lances that were incredibly light but still devastatingly effective on impact. Contemporary accounts record that these lances were designed to shatter on first contact, making them single-use weapons for an initial charge that would break enemy formations completely. Sobieski had commanded these warriors for decades. He knew exactly how to use them. Letters to his wife, Maria Kazimiera, reveal his motivations for accepting Vienna's defense. Religious duty certainly played a role. Sobieski saw himself as a defender of Christendom against Muslim expansion. But strategic calculation mattered just as much. If Vienna fell, Poland would face Ottoman power alone, without Habsburg allies to share the burden. Helping Vienna wasn't altruism, but survival. On March 31, 1683, Sobieski signed the Treaty of Warsaw, committing Poland to Vienna's relief. What followed was a masterpiece of rapid mobilization. Polish military logistics records show the assembly of approximately 27,000 troops, including nearly 3,000 winged hussars, the largest concentration of elite heavy cavalry in Europe. Moving this force from Poland to Vienna in just 3 weeks demonstrated organizational brilliance that matched Sobieski's tactical skill. At 54, most commanders would direct battles from safety. Sobieski would lead the charge himself, as Polish tradition demanded. The question wasn't whether he could still fight, but whether age had slowed the warrior's instincts that made him dangerous. Vienna would find out. As Sobieski gathered his winged cavalry in Poland, Vienna's defenders had no idea salvation was coming. They only knew that Ottoman mining had brought them to the edge of annihilation. The underground war was about to decide everything. What approached Vienna in July 1683 wasn't just an army. It was a mobile city of conquest. Ottoman military logistics records document the scale of Kara Mustafa's force with bureaucratic precision. Contemporary chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, struggled to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed. The column stretched for miles, so long that its vanguard could arrive at a destination while its rear guard still hadn't departed the previous camp. At the core marched approximately 12,000 to 15,000 janissaries, the empire's elite infantry. These weren't conscripts or feudal levies, but professional soldiers recruited through the Devshirme system and trained from childhood in warfare's brutal arts. Ottoman military records describe their equipment: muskets for firepower, yatagan swords for close combat, distinctive white felt caps that marked them as the Sultan's chosen warriors. By 1683, the Janissaries had become a politically powerful class with interests in trade and urban politics. But their military effectiveness remained formidable. The Sipahi cavalry provided the army's mobile striking power. These weren't professional soldiers, but provincial landholders who held taimars, land grants given in exchange for military service. Contemporary accounts estimate their numbers at 20,000 to 25,000, though exact figures remain disputed. They brought their own horses, their own weapons, their own retainers. Quality varied dramatically by region. Anatolian Sipahis were considered the finest, while those from more distant provinces sometimes barely qualified as cavalry. Then came the Crimean Tatars, and this is where the Ottoman army transformed into something terrifying. Khan Murad Girey commanded somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 Tatar light cavalry. These warriors served as the Ottoman army's eyes and ears, screening the main force's movements while devastating the countryside for miles around. Contemporary Habsburg accounts document their tactics with horror. Entire villages burned, populations massacred or dragged into slavery, crops destroyed, wells poisoned. The Tatars fought not for territory but for human plunder, slaves who would be marched to Ottoman markets and sold. Austrian chronicles record the destruction of villages like Perchtoldsdorf, where more than 3,000 inhabitants were massacred and survivors enslaved. The psychological impact was calculated and devastating. As news of Tatar atrocities spread, refugees flooded into Vienna by the thousands, straining the city's food supplies even before the siege began. Supporting these combat forces came an administrative tale that defied European comprehension. Ottoman siege operations required specialists, sappers to dig mines, engineers to calculate angles of artillery fire, craftsmen to maintain weapons, laborers to build fortifications. Contemporary estimates suggest 5,000 to 7,000 men in these technical roles alone. Artillery formed its own mobile fortress. Sources disagree on exact numbers, with estimates ranging from 130 to 300 pieces. But all accounts agree the Ottoman artillery train was massive. Bronze cannons of various calibers, from small anti-personnel pieces to enormous bombards designed to crack stone walls. Each cannon required its own timber gun carriage, its own ammunition supply, its own crew. Moving this artillery train required thousands of draft animals and specialized wagons. Then there were the camp followers, servants, merchants, and slaves who accompanied any early modern army. Conservative estimates place this number at 60,000 to 80,000 non-combatants. They provided services that kept the fighting force operational: cooking, laundry, equipment repair, medical care of a sort. The Grand Vizier alone traveled with a personal household numbering in the hundreds. Add it all together, and contemporary sources estimated the Ottoman host at between 150,000 and 300,000 total souls. Modern military historians, accounting for medieval exaggeration and the difficulty of accurate counting, suggest a more realistic figure of 100,000 to 120,000 combat troops, plus support personnel. Even at the conservative estimate, this was the largest Ottoman army ever assembled for a European campaign. The march itself became a demonstration of Ottoman logistics mastery. Supplied from secure bases in Ottoman-controlled Hungary, the army moved with surprising speed. Contemporary accounts describe daily marches of 10 to 15 miles, impressive for a force of this size. Advance parties established camps, dug latrines, prepared water sources. The army moved like a massive organism with its own internal rhythm. By early July, Ottoman scouts had reached the outskirts of Vienna. On July 14th, the vanguard arrived. On July 16th, Kara Mustafa's main force appeared before the city walls. What Vienna's defenders saw from their ramparts must have frozen blood. The plain before the city filled with tents as far as the eye could see. Ottoman standards flew in the hundreds. The sound of drums and horns echoed across the Danube. This was power incarnate. The military might of the world's largest empire focused on a single target. Inside Vienna's walls, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg faced the impossible. He commanded perhaps 15,000 effective troops against an enemy that outnumbered him at least 7 to 1. His walls, though modernized, weren't complete. His supplies, though stockpiled, wouldn't last forever. And relief, if it came at all, was weeks away. But Starhemberg had one advantage the Ottomans didn't expect. He had time to prepare. The man who would hold Vienna for 60 days against impossible odds was a professional in an age of amateurs. Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg was born in 1638 into Austrian military nobility. Habsburg military records document his rise through competent service rather than political connections. Campaigns against the French, garrison duties in frontier fortresses, the slow accumulation of experience that created expert commanders. By 1683, at 45 years old, he'd seen enough warfare to understand what Vienna faced. Emperor Leopold I had appointed him military governor of Vienna, then fled the city on July 7th. Habsburg court records document Leopold's departure with his family and court, escaping west before the Ottoman noose closed. This left Starhemberg with supreme military authority and complete responsibility. Vienna would stand or fall based on his decisions alone. The first decision seemed insane. Contemporary accounts record that Starhemberg ordered the immediate demolition of Vienna's suburbs. The city's fortifications followed the Tres Italienne style that had revolutionized siege warfare. Developed in Italy and perfected across Europe, this system replaced medieval vertical walls with angular bastions designed to provide overlapping fields of fire. Vienna's walls formed a rough semicircle along the Danube, studded with 12 major bastions bearing names like Berg, Löwel, Melker. Each bastion projected outward from the main wall, allowing defenders to fire along the wall's face and catch attackers in crossfire. But Vienna's suburbs, settlements like Leopoldstadt that had grown outside the walls, provided cover for attackers. Buildings would give Ottoman forces shelter as they approached. Trees would screen their movements. Gardens and walls would break up defensive fire. Starhemberg raised it all. Contemporary engravings preserved in the British Library show the transformation. Where bustling neighborhoods had stood, Starhemberg created a glacis, an open killing ground that sloped gradually away from the walls. Nothing remained standing. Buildings were demolished, rubble scattered, even trees uprooted. Approaching forces would have to cross hundreds of yards of open ground under constant fire from the bastions. The human cost was enormous. Thousands of Viennese citizens watched their homes demolished by their own defenders. But military necessity overrode civilian suffering. Better homeless Austrians than intact neighborhoods sheltering Ottoman attackers. Inside the walls, Starhemberg organized his defense with systematic precision. Military chronicles document his garrison's composition. Approximately 11,000 to 15,000 professional soldiers, sources disagree on exact numbers, plus 5,000 to 8,000 armed citizens and militia. University students formed volunteer companies. Guild members organized by trade into defensive units. Every able-bodied man who could lift a weapon received a position on the walls. Artillery became the defense's backbone. Habsburg records inventory Vienna's guns. Dozens of cannons positioned on the bastions, mortars for indirect fire, smaller pieces to sweep the glacis. Starhemberg established an ammunition factory inside the city, using church bells melted down to cast new shot. Powder magazines were distributed throughout the defenses to prevent a single lucky Ottoman shell from destroying Vienna's entire supply. But Starhemberg knew artillery alone wouldn't save Vienna. The real war would be fought underground. Ottoman siege doctrine in 1683 emphasized mining warfare. Sappers would dig tunnels toward the city's bastions, working beneath the walls to create chambers where gunpowder could be placed, detonate enough powder, and even the strongest fortification would collapse into rubble. The Ottomans had perfected this technique during the 21-year siege of Candia in Crete, the longest siege in history. Starhemberg responded by recruiting every miner, mason, and tunnel worker he could find. These men became Vienna's countermining teams. Their job was to dig their own tunnels, listening through the earth for the sound of Ottoman picks. When they detected enemy digging, they'd tunnel toward it to intercept the Ottoman sappers and fight them in the dark. The fortification improvements continued even as the Ottomans approached. Engineers strengthened weak points, added palisades, dug deeper moats. Contemporary accounts describe a city transformed into a fortress, every building near the walls converted into a strong point, every street barricaded to create fallback positions. Food supplies presented a critical challenge. Habsburg logistics records show Starhemberg ordered a census of all food in the city. Rationing implemented immediately. Grain reserves, calculated to feed the population for several months if managed carefully. Livestock herded into pens inside the walls. Wine cellars inventoried, more for morale than nutrition. Then there was the question of civilians. Historical accounts document Starhemberg's calculation. Thousands of refugees had fled to Vienna ahead of the Ottoman advance, straining food supplies. Women, children, the elderly. None could fight, but all needed food. Some advisors urged expulsion, pushing civilians out before the siege began to conserve supplies for the garrison. Starhemberg refused. Expelling civilians would hand them to Ottoman forces, ensuring massacre or slavery. Chronicles record his declaration that Vienna would protect all who sought its walls. This was both moral choice and tactical calculation. A city fighting for its people would fight harder than one defending empty stones. By July 14th, when Ottoman scouts appeared, Vienna was as ready as Starhemberg could make it. The walls bristled with artillery. The garrison knew its positions. Supplies were stockpiled and rationed. Countermining teams stood ready. But even Starhemberg, experienced and competent, couldn't have imagined what the Ottomans were about to unleash. Because Kara Mustafa brought something Vienna had never faced. An engineering expertise refined over decades of siege warfare, backed by the determination to reduce these walls to rubble no matter the cost. The siege of Vienna was about to become a masterclass in early modern warfare's most brutal form. The surface war was terrible. The underground war was hell. As Ottoman trenches crept toward Vienna's walls, a different battle raged in darkness beneath the earth. This was siege warfare's most terrifying dimension, where men fought blind in tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through, where fire and smoke became weapons more deadly than swords, where a single mistake could bury you alive. Ottoman mining techniques in 1683 represented the peak of pre-industrial siege engineering. Chronicles document the systematic approach. First, dig approached trenches in zigzag patterns to minimize exposure to defensive fire. These trenches allowed thousands of soldiers to move safely toward the walls. Then, once close enough, begin the real work, tunneling beneath the fortifications themselves. The process required specialized skills. Sappers would dig narrow shafts angling downward beneath the city's moat, then horizontally under the walls themselves. Contemporary engineering reports describe the challenge. Dig too shallow, and the defenders could detect you easily. Dig too deep, and you'd never reach your target. The angles had to be calculated precisely, accounting for soil composition, water tables, and the fortification's architecture. Once beneath a bastion, sappers would excavate a chamber large enough to hold hundreds of barrels of gunpowder. Wooden props supported the tunnel to prevent collapse during excavation. When ready, sappers would place the powder, lay a fuse, remove the supporting timbers, and retreat. The explosion would collapse the tunnel, and hopefully, the bastion above it. The Ottomans had perfected this system during the siege of Candia, which lasted 21 years and became a laboratory for mining warfare. Veterans of that epic siege now brought their expertise to Vienna. They knew how to calculate powder charges, how to shore up tunnels in difficult soil, how to time explosions for maximum effect. Vienna's countermining teams faced a terrifying challenge: find and stop these tunnels before they could destroy the city's defenses. The technique was brutal in its simplicity. Viennese miners would dig their own tunnels, stopping periodically to press their ears against the earth or use primitive listening devices, basically wooden bowls that amplified sound. Contemporary accounts describe the eerie experience: absolute silence broken only by breathing, then faint sounds, the scrape of picks, the murmur of voices in Turkish, the sounds of your own death being dug toward you. When Viennese counterminers detected an Ottoman tunnel, they had two options. First, dig toward it and engage the enemy sappers in hand-to-hand combat in the dark. These underground melees were nightmarish affairs fought with short swords, pistols, and desperate brutality in spaces so confined men could barely turn around. Contemporary chronicles record the use of smoke grenades to suffocate enemy miners, fires lit in tunnels to consume oxygen, anything to gain advantage in conditions that stripped warfare down to its most primitive. Second option, dig your own chamber next to the Ottoman tunnel and blow it up first, collapsing their works before they could finish. This required winning the race to complete excavation, a desperate competition measured in hours. The first major Ottoman mine detonated in late July. Habsburg military reports document the explosion's effect. The ground shook, walls cracked, and a section of palisade collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris. The blast killed several defenders outright and opened a breach that Ottoman infantry immediately tried to exploit. But Starhemberg had prepared for this. Contemporary accounts describe his defensive doctrine: every breach immediately filled with desperate counterattacks, fresh troops rushed to plug gaps, artillery repositioned to fire point blank into attacking forces. The Ottoman assault was repulsed with heavy casualties, but the message was clear. The mining war would determine Vienna's fate. Then, Vienna lost its chief engineer. Georg Rimpler, the master of countermining operations, was killed by an Ottoman mine explosion in early August. Military records document the disaster. Rimpler had been inspecting counter-mining works when an Ottoman charge detonated prematurely, collapsing the tunnel and burying him alive. His death deprived Vienna of its most experienced mining engineer at the campaign's critical phase. Starhemberg promoted replacements, but expertise lost couldn't be quickly replaced. The pace of Ottoman mining increased. By late August, Habsburg reports counted multiple active mining operations at any given time. The Berg Bastion, the Lovell Bastion, the Melker Ravelin all faced tunnels creeping beneath them. The psychological toll on defenders was immense. Contemporary diaries preserved from Vienna describe the constant anxiety. You'd be standing watch on a bastion, not knowing if beneath your feet Ottoman sappers were placing powder that could blow you into the air at any moment. Sleep became impossible. Every rumble, every vibration might be the last thing you'd feel. Inside the tunnels themselves, conditions defied description. Contemporary accounts mention the heat, the lack of oxygen, the constant danger of collapse. Men worked by candlelight in spaces barely wide enough to swing a pick. The earth itself became an enemy, unstable soil threatening to bury workers with every blow. Water seeped through walls, flooding tunnels, drowning men trapped in cave-ins. The Ottomans suffered too. Habsburg intelligence gathered from captured sappers documented Ottoman casualties in the mining war. Collapses killed entire teams. Counter-mining operations caught sappers off guard and slaughtered them in the dark. Disease spread rapidly in the confined spaces. Yet the work continued relentlessly, driven by Kara Mustafa's determination to crack Vienna's defenses. By early September, the mining war reached crisis point. Ottoman sappers had successfully placed multiple large charges beneath key bastions. Habsburg engineering reports documented the dire situation. The Berg Bastion undermined, the Lovell Bastion compromised, several ravelins barely standing. Explosions occurred daily, sometimes multiple times per day, slowly reducing Vienna's defenses to rubble. Contemporary accounts report that Ottoman mines had opened massive breaches in several locations. The walls that should have protected Vienna were becoming more liability than defense. Weakened structures ready to collapse at any moment. But here's where Starhemberg revealed the quality that would save Vienna. While his walls crumbled, while disease and starvation weakened his garrison, he refused to consider surrender. Habsburg military correspondence from this period shows his calculation. Every day Vienna held was another day for relief to arrive, even if holding cost everything. On the eve of September 12th, Ottoman sappers were reportedly minutes away from detonating a final series of mines that would have collapsed Vienna's inner defenses. The city had perhaps hours left. Relief would arrive with literally no time to spare. While engineers fought their underground war, another battle raged inside Vienna's walls. This one was against starvation, disease, and despair. Contemporary diarists preserved accounts of Vienna's deterioration that read like medical case studies in urban collapse. The siege began in mid-July, with the city reasonably well supplied. Habsburg logistics records documented grain reserves calculated to last several months under rationing. Livestock provided fresh meat. Wells supplied water. For the first weeks, conditions inside Vienna remained tolerable. By August, everything changed. Ottoman artillery bombardment created the first crisis. Heavy guns positioned in siege batteries fired day and night into the city. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological warfare. Ottoman mortars lobbed shells over the walls to explode randomly in streets and buildings. No place was safe. Sleep became impossible. The constant fear of sudden death ground down morale more effectively than any direct assault. But artillery merely killed. Disease slaughtered. The combination of overcrowding from refugees, summer heat, damage to sanitation systems. and inability to properly bury the dead created perfect conditions for epidemic. Habsburg medical records document the outbreak of what contemporary sources called the Red Flux, virulent dysentery that spread through the crowded city with devastating speed. The symptoms were horrific. Contemporary medical accounts describe severe diarrhea mixed with blood, dehydration that turned skin gray and eyes sunken. Death within days of onset for many victims. Without modern medicine or even basic understanding of germ theory, defenders could do nothing but isolate the sick and pray. Monasteries like the Schottenstift were converted into military hospitals. Accounts from monks who served as nurses describe conditions that overwhelmed their capacity to help. Hundreds of sick and wounded packed into spaces designed for dozens. The stench of gangrenous wounds, infected injuries, and disease-filled buildings. Men died faster than bodies could be removed. The epidemic claimed more defenders than Ottoman weapons. Habsburg casualty records suggest disease reduced the garrison's fighting strength by nearly 2/3 by mid-September. Positions on the walls that should have been manned by 10 men had 3. Artillery crews too weak from illness to properly serve their guns. Counter-mining teams unable to maintain the pace of work as workers collapsed. Then came the food crisis. By late August, rationing had been tightened to starvation levels. Contemporary accounts describe the progression. First, slaughter of draft animals for meat. Then horses, even the prized cavalry mounts. Citizens ate dogs, cats, rats, anything with protein. Accounts mention grass boiled into soup, leather boots stewed into edible paste. The psychological impact of starvation compounded physical weakness. Modern studies of siege conditions document how malnutrition affects judgment, increases aggression, destroys social bonds. Habsburg records from Vienna describe rising tensions between civilians and soldiers over food distribution. Fights breaking out over scraps, accusations of hoarding and theft. Water became another crisis. While wells inside the walls still functioned, Ottoman control of the surrounding terrain made it impossible to supplement supplies. In August heat, wearing armor, fighting and digging, defenders needed massive amounts of water. Rationing meant chronic dehydration that compounded disease's effects. Starhemberg faced an impossible calculation. Tighten rationing further, and men would be too weak to fight. Maintain current levels and food would run out before relief could possibly arrive. Contemporary correspondence shows he chose a middle path. Keep soldiers fed at near starvation levels. Reduce civilian rations to the bare minimum for survival. The moral burden of this choice appears in letters Starhemberg wrote during the siege. He knew he was condemning civilians to slow death by starvation. Habsburg archives preserve his correspondence with subordinate officers. Maintain the garrison's strength no matter the cost to civilians. Professional military necessity overriding human compassion. But civilians were dying anyway. Contemporary death records document the toll. Hundreds per week by late August, the majority from disease and starvation rather than Ottoman weapons. Mass graves were dug inside the city because retrieving bodies from rubble under fire was impossible. The dead were buried with minimal ceremony, wrapped in whatever cloth was available, sometimes just piled into pits. The psychological warfare intensified. Ottoman forces positioned close to the walls would shout across in German, promising food and safety to anyone who surrendered. Contemporary accounts describe defenders' response: defiant insults and musket fire. But the temptation must have been enormous for men watching their families starve. Then there was the waiting. Every day brought the same grinding routine. Man the walls, dig countermines, repair breaches, bury the dead, pray for relief. Habsburg diaries document the mental toll. Men started seeing relief armies that weren't there. Rumors spread that Sobieski had been defeated, that no help was coming, that they'd been abandoned to die. Starhemberg's leadership became crucial. Contemporary accounts describe him constantly visible on the walls, inspecting positions, encouraging troops, maintaining discipline through personal example. Habsburg military culture emphasized leading from the front, and Starhemberg embodied this. He shared the same dangers, ate the same meager rations, demonstrated that officers suffered alongside common soldiers. By early September, the situation inside Vienna had become critical beyond description. The garrison was at perhaps 1/3 effective strength. Walls were breached in multiple locations. Food would last perhaps another week. Disease killed dozens daily, and still no sign of relief. Habsburg military correspondence from September 10th shows Starhemberg calculating how much longer Vienna could hold. His estimate, 3 days, possibly 4. After that, the garrison would be too weak to man the walls, supplies completely exhausted, defenses too damaged to maintain. On September 11th, as Ottoman sappers prepared their final mine detonations, someone spotted signal fires on the Kahlenberg Heights to the northwest. At first, defenders thought it was another false alarm, another psychological trick, exhaustion-induced hallucination. But the fires were real. After 60 days of hell, relief had arrived. Whether they'd arrived in time was still an open question. While Vienna died slowly, the coalition Pope Innocent had assembled was learning to work together. This proved almost as difficult as fighting the Ottomans. The Treaty of Warsaw committed Poland to Vienna's defense, but Polish and Habsburg forces had never fought together in a major campaign. Different languages, different military traditions, different tactical doctrines, all created friction that could shatter the coalition before it ever engaged the enemy. King John Sobieski departed Poland in mid-August with approximately 27,000 troops. Polish military chronicles document the composition: 3,000 winged hussars forming the elite corps, 8,000 to 10,000 panzerny medium cavalry, 4,000 light cavalry, and 9,000 infantry. The Polish army moved fast, covering the distance from Warsaw to the rendezvous point in roughly 3 weeks, an impressive pace for heavy cavalry. But speed came at a cost. Polish logistics records mention supplies left behind to maintain pace. Soldiers went days without proper rations, horses fed on grass and bark rather than grain. By the time they reached the rendezvous, the Polish army was lean and hungry, but it was there. Duke Charles V of Lorraine commanded the Imperial Habsburg forces, approximately 18,000 to 23,000 troops. Habsburg military records document his complicated relationship with Sobieski. Charles had lost several engagements to the Ottomans earlier in the campaign. His military reputation was competent, but not brilliant. Now he was being asked to serve under a foreign king, a blow to both ego and protocol. Pope Innocent's diplomacy prevented disaster. Papal correspondence documents the compromise. Sobieski would have supreme command, but Charles would retain significant autonomy over imperial forces. This divided command structure violated every military principle, but it was the only way to keep the coalition together. The German imperial states contributed the coalition's bulk. Maximilian II, Emmanuel of Bavaria, brought 11,000 professional troops. Elector John George III of Saxony added 9,000. Smaller principalities from Swabia, Franconia, and other German states contributed contingents ranging from hundreds to thousands. Each commander jealously guarded his own authority. Each contingent maintained its own supply system. Each unit followed its own tactical doctrine. Contemporary accounts describe the chaos at the rendezvous point near Tulln. Imagine coordinating 30-plus separate military commands, speaking different languages, following different orders, all trying to march in the same direction. Officers argued over precedence, which units would have honor positions in the line, who would advance first and claim glory. Sobieski's diplomatic skills proved as important as his military talents. Polish diplomatic correspondence preserved from this period shows his careful management of rival egos. He flattered the German princes, deferred to their expertise on local terrain, praised their troops' quality. Meanwhile, he privately planned a battle that would use his Polish cavalry as the decisive striking force. The critical meeting occurred September 3rd at Stetteldorf Castle. Coalition commanders gathered to finalize the plan. Contemporary accounts describe heated debates. Some argued for a cautious approach, gradually pressuring Ottoman forces to lift the siege. Others wanted a direct assault on the Ottoman camp. Sobieski pushed for bold action. Time was critical. Vienna couldn't hold much longer. A cautious approach would arrive too late. The coalition needed to hit the Ottomans hard and fast, breaking their siege before the city fell. The plan that emerged combined Habsburg local knowledge with Sobieski's cavalry tactics. The relief army would approach through the Vienna woods, the Wienerwald, a heavily forested region northwest of the city. This would allow them to reach the Kahlenberg Heights overlooking the Ottoman camp, while screened from view by the forest. The terrain presented enormous challenges. Contemporary maps show the Wienerwald as dense forest crossed by few roads, with steep hills and narrow valleys. Moving 70,000 troops with artillery through this terrain would require abandoning heavy equipment and accepting slow progress. But the strategic advantage was clear. If the coalition could reach the Kahlenberg undetected, they'd hold the high ground, overlooking the entire battlefield. Ottoman forces besieging Vienna would have to fight uphill against fresh troops while maintaining the siege. The trap was obvious in retrospect, but achieving it required perfect execution. Military logistics records document the preparations. Artillery too heavy for forest roads was left behind. Only lighter field pieces could make the march. Supply wagons were reduced to bare essentials. Speed and surprise would matter more than overwhelming firepower. On September 10th, the Holy League began its march through the Vienna woods. Contemporary accounts describe the difficulties. Paths barely wide enough for wagons, equipment abandoned when roads became impassable, horses struggling up steep slopes. The Polish heavy cavalry, designed for open-field warfare, had to lead their mounts through forest trails barely suitable for infantry. Inside Vienna, defenders had no idea relief was so close. Ottoman forces completely controlled the approaches to the city. No messenger could get through to inform Starhemberg that help was coming. Vienna would have to survive on faith alone. But on the evening of September 11th, as the sun set over Vienna's battered walls, signal fires blazed to life on the Kahlenberg Heights. The sight was visible from Vienna's bastions, visible from the Ottoman camp, visible for miles across the plain. The Holy League had arrived. The signal fires on the Kahlenberg transformed everything. Inside Vienna, defenders wept with relief. In the Ottoman camp, Kara Mustafa faced the decision that would determine the campaign's outcome. Habsburg defenders watching from Vienna's walls saw the fires and understood. Relief had arrived. Contemporary diaries describe the moment as electric. Men who'd been fighting for 60 days with no hope suddenly had a reason to survive one more night. Starhemberg immediately ordered increased rations, a calculated risk to give his men strength for the final effort. But Vienna's trials weren't over. Ottoman forces intensified bombardment throughout the night, trying to breach the walls one final time before relief could intervene. Habsburg military reports document hundreds of artillery rounds fired into the city during the night of September 11th. The Ottomans knew they were running out of time. Inside the Ottoman camp, the Grand Vizier faced an impossible calculation. Military logic demanded he abandon the siege immediately and redeploy his forces to face the relief army on favorable ground. Ottoman commanders argued for this option. Crimean Khan Murad Girey reportedly urged Kara Mustafa to lift the siege, take the massive Ottoman army to the plains south of Vienna, and crush the relief force in open battle where Ottoman cavalry superiority would be decisive. Kara Mustafa refused. Ottoman chronicles document his reasoning, or what later critics claimed was his reasoning. He'd invested 60 days and thousands of casualties in this siege. Vienna was on the verge of collapse. One more push would crack the defenses. Ottoman sappers reported their mines were ready for final detonation. The city would fall within hours. More cynically, observers suggested greed motivated his decision. Abandoning the siege meant abandoning Vienna's plunder, the wealth that had drawn Kara Mustafa here in the first place. Better to finish the siege quickly, take the city, then turn with its resources to face the relief army. Whatever his reasoning, Kara Mustafa made the fatal choice. He would maintain the siege while simultaneously fighting the relief army. Ottoman forces would be divided between two objectives, split between continuing the assault on Vienna and defending against the coalition descending from the Kahlenberg. Contemporary military analysts still debate this decision. Some argue Kara Mustafa had no choice. Lifting a siege after 60 days would be viewed as failure, undermining his political position. Others contend he simply misunderstood the scale of forces approaching. Ottoman intelligence may have underestimated coalition strength, leading Kara Mustafa to believe he could handle both tasks simultaneously. Regardless of reasoning, the decision sealed Ottoman fate. Through the night, Ottoman forces frantically redeployed. Units that had been focused on siege works now had to prepare for field battle. Artillery was repositioned to face the Kahlenberg rather than Vienna's walls. Supply lines that had been focused on supporting siege operations now had to supply troops preparing for a major engagement. Meanwhile, on the Kahlenberg Heights, the Holy League prepared for battle. Contemporary accounts describe the scene as almost surreal. 70,000 troops camped on the wooded slopes overlooking Vienna. Signal fires blazed to mark their position, but also to illuminate the massive Ottoman camp spread across the plain below. From the heights, coalition soldiers could see everything. Ottoman trenches surrounding Vienna, massive artillery batteries, tent cities housing over 100,000 enemy soldiers. King Sobieski established his command post on the Kahlenberg summit. Polish correspondence describes his actions that evening, conferring with German commanders, finalizing the battle plan, attending Mass celebrated by Marco d'Aviano. The Capuchin friar's presence provided spiritual dimension to military preparations. Contemporary accounts describe Marco's sermon before battle, emphasizing this was God's work, defending Christendom against infidel invasion. Whether his words actually affected combat effectiveness is unprovable, but chroniclers credit him with inspiring troops to extraordinary courage. The tactical plan was refined through the night. The coalition would descend from the Kahlenberg in 3 wings. The imperial left wing under Charles of Lorraine would engage Ottoman forces in the villages north of Vienna. The center, composed primarily of German imperial forces, would advance through the middle terrain. The Polish right wing under Sobieski would maneuver through the most difficult terrain, but would position the devastating heavy cavalry for the decisive blow. Timing would be everything. The battle couldn't begin until all wings were in position. but delay would give the Ottomans more time to prepare. Contemporary battle plans suggest a dawn attack, but the difficult terrain meant units would likely still be maneuvering well into the morning. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg prepared for what he hoped would be the siege's final day. Habsburg records document his orders. Every man who could stand would man the walls. If the Ottomans made a final assault while the relief army engaged, Vienna's weakened garrison would have to hold long enough for coalition forces to intervene. The night of September 11th to 12th was the shortest of the year for everyone involved. Defenders in Vienna too excited and terrified to sleep. Ottoman soldiers frantically digging new defensive positions. Coalition troops resting as best they could before dawn's approach. Contemporary weather reports describe September 12th as dawning clear and mild. Perfect conditions for battle. As the sun rose over the Kahlenberg, 70,000 coalition soldiers began their descent toward the largest battle either side had ever fought. Kara Mustafa's gamble was about to be tested. Vienna's fate, the coalition's survival, the future of European history, all would be decided in the next 12 hours. At 4 in the morning, the Ottoman right wing attacked. Contemporary battle accounts describe the engagement's start as a preemptive strike. Ottoman forces under Kara Mehmed Pasha, positioned in villages north of Vienna, didn't wait for the coalition to reach the plain. They advanced uphill into the Vienna woods, attempting to catch the descending imperial left wing, while still strung out on forest trails. The fighting centered on the villages of Nussdorf and Heiligenstadt, small settlements clinging to the wooded slopes. Habsburg military reports document brutal close-quarters combat as German and Austrian infantry fought to clear Ottoman forces from stone buildings and garden walls. This wasn't the sweeping cavalry action commanders envisioned, but grinding infantry warfare, where every house became a fortress. Duke Charles of Lorraine commanded the imperial left wing. Approximately 18,000 troops navigating terrain that favored defenders. Contemporary accounts describe his methodical approach. Infantry advances supported by what limited artillery could be brought through the forest paths. Each village cleared building by building. The terrain was a nightmare for coordination. Wooded slopes cut by ravines and dotted with vineyards meant units lost visual contact with neighbors. Contemporary battle reports mention officers sending messengers to find adjacent units, only to discover they'd veered off course hours before. The careful battle plan was becoming improvised chaos. But the imperial left had one advantage: numerical weight. Ottoman forces defending this sector numbered perhaps 20,000, less than the coalition forces attacking them. By mid-morning, Habsburg reports document steady progress. Nussdorf fell after hours of fighting. Heiligenstadt's defenders were pushed back. The imperial left was securing the northern flank, slowly but effectively. In the center, the bulk of German imperial forces descended through marginally better terrain. Bavarian and Saxon infantry advanced in formation, maintaining cohesion that the left wing struggled to achieve. Contemporary accounts describe their methodical progress. Clear the next ridgeline, consolidate positions, advance again. Ottoman forces facing the center put up fierce resistance, but were steadily pushed back. Janissary units held key positions stubbornly, forcing coalition infantry to pry them out at bayonet point. Contemporary casualty reports suggest this central fighting was where both sides took heaviest losses. Face-to-face infantry combat with muskets and cold steel produced horrific results on both sides. By noon, the coalition center had advanced to within range of the main Ottoman camp. Artillery batteries that had been dragged through the Vienna woods began unlimbering on captured ridges, firing into Ottoman positions that had been designed to face Vienna, not threats from the northwest. But all of this was preliminary. The real battle was still developing on the coalition's right wing, where King Sobieski was maneuvering his Polish forces into position. Contemporary Polish military accounts describe the nightmare of moving heavy cavalry through the Vienna woods. The terrain was significantly worse than maps suggested. Steep ravines forced detours. Dense forest made it impossible to maintain formation. The famous heavy cavalry had to dismount and lead their horses over the worst terrain. Sobieski's battle plan required the Polish right wing to sweep wide, moving through the most difficult terrain to position themselves on the Ottoman left flank. This would allow the devastating cavalry charge, Polish military doctrine's ultimate weapon, to strike from an unexpected direction. But executing this maneuver took time. While the left and center engaged Ottoman forces, the Polish wing was still scrambling through forest trails. Contemporary accounts describe Sobieski's frustration as hours passed and his cavalry remained tangled in terrain. Inside the Ottoman camp, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Kara Mustafa had committed approximately 10,000 Janissaries to continue the siege assault on Vienna, hoping to crack the walls before the relief army could fully deploy. But this divided his force at the critical moment. Ottoman units were split between facing Vienna and facing the coalition, unable to concentrate strength on either objective. Worse, the Ottoman defensive position was inherently flawed. The camp had been organized for siege operations, not field defense. Supply lines ran toward the south and east. Artillery faced Vienna's walls. Fortifications were designed to protect against sorties from the city, not attacks from the northwest. Contemporary Ottoman accounts describe growing panic among commanders. Units were being redeployed even as fighting raged. Artillery was being turned to face new threats while still under fire. The massive Ottoman army was becoming a confused mass rather than a coordinated fighting force. By early afternoon, approximately 2 in the afternoon, according to contemporary time estimates, the situation had stabilized into brutal attrition. The imperial left had secured the northern villages, but was exhausted from hours of fighting. The center had advanced, but faced determined Janissary resistance. And the Polish right was still maneuvering into final position. Inside Vienna, defenders could hear the battle raging to the northwest. Starhemberg ordered a sortie, Vienna's garrison attacking Ottoman siege lines from inside while the relief army pressed from outside. Contemporary accounts describe desperate fighting as weakened defenders climbed over their own battered walls to engage Ottoman trenches. The pincer was closing, but the decisive moment hadn't arrived. Both sides were bleeding. Both were exhausted. Both were committed to a struggle that would determine Central Europe's fate. Then, around 6 in the evening, after nearly 12 hours of grinding combat, everything changed. The Polish heavy cavalry had finally maneuvered into position. 18,000 horsemen assembled on the high ground south of the Kahlenberg, looking down on the Ottoman left flank. King John III Sobieski, at 54 years old, prepared to lead the largest cavalry charge in European history. What descended from the Kahlenberg Heights at approximately 6 o'clock on the evening of September 12th was more than a military formation. It was the accumulated weight of a century of Polish cavalry tradition unleashed in one devastating blow. Contemporary accounts from both sides document the moment with almost reverent detail. Sobieski positioned himself at the front of the formation, Polish tradition demanding the king lead personally. Around him assembled the cream of Polish nobility, the winged hussars whose ancestors had perfected shock cavalry tactics over generations. The formation that modern military historians estimate at 18,000 to 20,000 cavalry stretched across nearly 2 miles of front. At the center, approximately 3,000 winged hussars in their distinctive armor. On the flanks, pancerni medium cavalry and lighter units. Behind, supporting waves ready to exploit any breakthrough. Contemporary Polish sources describe the preparation. Horses, exhausted from the march through Vienna woods, were given time to rest and feed. Armor was polished one final time. The famous lances, the kopie, were distributed, each hussar checking the balance of his 20-foot weapon. Prayer was offered. Then, at Sobieski's signal, the formation began to move. The terrain favored cavalry in a way the morning's fighting had not. The slopes south of Kahlenberg were open ground, rolling hills that allowed horses to build speed. The Ottoman left wing, positioned to defend against threats from the north, suddenly faced an avalanche of heavy cavalry descending from the west. What happened in the next 30 minutes would be documented by chroniclers on both sides as one of warfare's most devastating demonstrations of shock tactics applied perfectly. The charge began at a walk. 18,000 horses moving in coordination, maintaining formation despite the slope and distance. Contemporary accounts describe the sound. A rumble that grew from whisper to thunder as thousands of hooves struck earth in rhythm. The famous hussar wings created their distinctive rushing sound, meant to terrify enemy horses and signal Polish nobility's presence. Ottoman forces facing this charge had approximately 10 minutes to prepare. Contemporary Muslim chronicles record the moment Ottoman commanders realized what was descending on them. Orders were shouted to form defensive squares, to position pikes to receive cavalry, to ready muskets for volley fire. Janissary units that had been engaged with German forces tried to redeploy to face this new threat. But 10 minutes wasn't enough. The Ottoman left wing wasn't prepared for massed heavy cavalry. Their formations were designed for the siege, not field battle against the era's most effective shock cavalry. As the distance closed, the charge accelerated. Walk became trot, trot became canter, canter became gallop. By the time the Polish cavalry covered the final 500 yards, they were moving at full speed. Contemporary estimates suggest somewhere between 20 to 30 miles per hour, not fast by modern standards, but devastating when you multiply 18,000 horsemen by that velocity. The front rank, the winged hussars with their 20-foot lances, hit Ottoman lines like a bronze wave. Contemporary accounts struggle to describe the impact. The lances, designed to shatter on contact, exploded as they punched through Ottoman infantry formations. The sheer kinetic energy of armored cavalry moving at speed simply crushed men who tried to stand. Ottoman defensive squares, effective against less organized cavalry, couldn't withstand the coordinated weight of Polish assault. Polish military doctrine called for the charge to punch completely through enemy formations, cavalry maintaining forward momentum rather than stopping to engage. Contemporary accounts describe hussars riding completely through Ottoman lines, wheeling and charging again through the gaps they'd created. Behind the front rank came waves of supporting cavalry. The pancerni exploited breaches the hussars opened. Light cavalry swept around flanks, cutting down fleeing infantry, preventing any organized retreat. What started as a charge became a pursuit, then became a massacre. The psychological effect was even more devastating than physical destruction. Ottoman soldiers watching the charge approach saw something that violated their understanding of warfare. Contemporary Muslim chronicles record Ottoman troops describing the Polish cavalry as demonic, unstoppable, an act of divine punishment. The famous wings, the polished armor catching evening sun, the inexorable advance, all combined to break morale before the first lance struck home. The Ottoman left wing didn't fight and lose. It shattered. Contemporary casualty reports suggest thousands of Ottoman troops died in the initial charge and pursuit. More importantly, the cohesion of Ottoman defensive lines collapsed completely. Units that might have rallied and reformed instead fled south and east in absolute panic. But Sobieski's tactical genius extended beyond the charge itself. Polish military records document his coordination with the imperial center and left. As the cavalry charge hit the Ottoman left, German and Austrian forces pressed forward on their fronts. The Ottomans faced simultaneous pressure across the entire line, preventing them from reinforcing the collapsing left wing. Inside the Ottoman camp, panic spread like fire. Soldiers saw their left wing disintegrating, saw Polish cavalry pouring through the gap, and understood the battle was lost. Contemporary accounts describe the moment when discipline failed. Units abandoned positions without orders. Soldiers fled toward supply camps. Commanders lost control of their forces. Kara Mustafa, watching from his command position, reportedly tried to rally the defense. Ottoman chronicles record his desperate orders to commit reserves, to form new defensive lines, to stop the rout before it became complete disaster. But the collapse had gained unstoppable momentum. By 7 o'clock in the evening, barely an hour after the charge began, the battlefield situation had transformed completely. The Ottoman army that had besieged Vienna for 60 days was in full retreat. The largest Islamic army ever assembled in Europe was fleeing in disorder before a coalition that hours before had been struggling just to advance. The pursuit phase was about to begin, and it would be merciless. What followed the cavalry charge wasn't battle anymore. It was systematic slaughter. Contemporary accounts from coalition forces describe the pursuit with a matter-of-factness that reveals early modern warfare's brutal reality. Polish cavalry, having shattered Ottoman lines, continued south and east, cutting down fleeing soldiers who'd thrown away weapons to run faster. German infantry advanced into the massive Ottoman camp, encountering scattered resistance, but mostly finding abandoned positions and terrified soldiers trying to hide or surrender. The Ottoman camp itself became a scene of absolute chaos. This wasn't a prepared military encampment, but a city of tents housing over 100,000 people, soldiers, servants, craftsmen, merchants, slaves. When the army fled, panic consumed everyone. Contemporary Habsburg reports document what coalition forces found. Entire sections of camp abandoned so quickly that meals were still cooking over fires. Artillery pieces spiked and left behind. Supply wagons loaded with ammunition and food simply deserted. The organized military machine that had besieged Vienna for 2 months dissolved into terrified individuals seeking any escape. But escape proved difficult. The tactical situation that had allowed the cavalry charge to succeed now trapped fleeing Ottoman forces. Coalition troops controlled the high ground northwest of the camp. Vienna's defenders, seeing Ottoman collapse, surged out of the city to attack siege positions from the east. Ottoman retreat routes led south and southeast, directly into pursuit. Contemporary casualty estimates for the pursuit phase vary wildly between sources. Ottoman chronicles, written by survivors and understandably reluctant to document scale of defeat, suggest thousands killed. Habsburg and Polish sources claim tens of thousands. Modern historians, analyzing the available evidence, estimate somewhere between 10,000 to 20,000 Ottoman casualties in the immediate pursuit, with many more wounded, captured, or dispersed. One Ottoman commander kept his head. Artabazis, commanding approximately 40,000 troops on the Ottoman left flank's extreme edge, saw Kara Mustafa's position collapse and immediately ordered withdrawal. Not a fighting retreat, but full flight. Contemporary accounts describe his ruthless decision. Abandon equipment, abandon wounded, abandon everything except speed. His forces marched south at double time, escaping before coalition pursuit could organize. Artabazas would reach Ottoman territory with most of his force intact, the only Ottoman success in a day of catastrophic failures. His survival likely prevented even worse disaster. Those 40,000 troops would form a rearguard that prevented coalition pursuit from completely destroying the Ottoman field army. But for forces trapped near Vienna, escape was nearly impossible. Coalition cavalry ranged across the countryside, hunting stragglers. Local Austrian populations, who'd suffered under Tatar raids for months, emerged to exact revenge on scattered Ottoman soldiers. Contemporary accounts mention farmers with scythes, townspeople with clubs, anyone with a weapon killing isolated enemy troops. The Tatar auxiliary forces, who'd terrorized Austrian villages during the siege, faced particular fury. Habsburg chronicles record summary executions of captured Tatars. No quarter given, no prisoners taken. The light cavalry that had served as Ottoman reconnaissance and raiding force now scattered into the Vienna woods, hunted like animals. As darkness fell on September 12th, the pursuit slowed simply because soldiers couldn't see to continue fighting. Contemporary accounts describe the battlefield as covered with bodies, abandoned equipment, and dying horses. The careful formation warfare of early modern armies had dissolved into medieval butchery. Inside Vienna, the defenders' reaction mixed joy, relief, and utter exhaustion. Habsburg diaries describe men collapsing on the walls, too weak to celebrate, just grateful to have survived. Starhemberg organized parties to secure the abandoned Ottoman trenches, recovering weapons and preventing any remnant forces from reoccupying positions. The Grand Vizier's fate during this chaos remains partially unclear. Ottoman sources document that Kara Mustafa initially tried to rally forces south of the camp, but failed to stop the rout. By nightfall, he was fleeing south with what remained of his personal guard, abandoning everything, including his command tent and personal treasury. That tent would become a powerful symbol. When coalition forces entered the Ottoman camp the next morning, they found Kara Mustafa's massive red pavilion still standing, a multi-chambered structure described by contemporary accounts as large as a palace. Inside, treasures beyond counting: gold, jewels, fine carpets, weapons, maps, the accumulated wealth of the Grand Vizier's campaign. Sobieski reportedly entered this tent and wrote his famous letter to Pope Innocent XI. Paraphrasing Julius Caesar, he penned, "Veni, vidi, Deus vicit." I came, I saw, God conquered. The letter acknowledged the victory not as personal achievement, but as divine intervention. The plunder extended far beyond the Grand Vizier's tent. Contemporary inventories document astounding quantities of material abandoned by fleeing Ottomans. Thousands of camels and horses, vast stores of grain and ammunition, artillery pieces numbering in the hundreds, tents, carpets, weapons, everything required to maintain a massive field army simply left behind. Among the most famous spoils were sacks of coffee beans. The legend, which historians debate but cannot definitively disprove, credits Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, a Polish-born spy who'd performed reconnaissance missions during the siege, with claiming the coffee as his reward. He supposedly opened Vienna's first coffee house and invented the Wiener melange by adding milk and honey to suit Austrian tastes. Similarly, the crescent-shaped Kipferl pastry gained legendary association with the victory. While the pastry itself predates 1683 by centuries, Viennese bakers supposedly began marketing it as a symbol of consuming and defeating the Ottoman crescent. Truth or marketing legend? The association became permanent in Austrian culinary culture. More verified was the fate of Kara Mustafa's personal effects. Sobieski sent the Grand Vizier's silver gilt stirrup to his wife, Queen Maria Kazimiera, as a trophy. He dispatched a banner from the command tent to Pope Innocent as evidence of victory. These objects became relics of Christian triumph, preserved in churches and museums as physical proof that Vienna was saved. By dawn on September 13th, the scale of Ottoman defeat was clear. The largest Islamic army ever assembled in Europe had been comprehensively destroyed as an effective fighting force. Casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Equipment losses eliminated any possibility of continuing the campaign. The siege of Vienna was over, ended by 12 hours of combat that reversed 60 days of Ottoman progress. But the consequences would extend far beyond Vienna's walls. The victory at Vienna didn't end the war. It began it. What followed was the Great Turkish War, 1683 to 1699, a series of campaigns that would push Ottoman forces out of Hungary and Transylvania completely. Contemporary military records document a succession of Habsburg and Holy League victories that built on the momentum Vienna created. The most decisive came at the Battle of Zenta on September 11, 1697. Prince Eugene of Savoy, who'd gained his military education during and after Vienna, led imperial forces in destroying another Ottoman army attempting to cross the Tisza River. Contemporary casualty reports document the slaughter. Over 20,000 Ottoman soldiers killed or drowned, with Habsburg losses under 500. Zenta broke Ottoman military will. Sultan Mustafa II, who'd personally commanded at Zenta and barely escaped with his life, recognized that continuing the war was impossible. Ottoman treasury records document the empire's financial exhaustion. Decades of warfare combined with internal administrative problems had drained resources needed to maintain the military effort. For the first time in Ottoman history, the empire negotiated a peace treaty as the defeated power on equal terms with European states. The Treaty of Karlowitz, signed January 26, 1699, represented a fundamental shift in diplomatic relations. Previous Ottoman treaties had been temporary truces that the Sultan granted as privileges, reflecting Islamic legal concepts of assault. Karlowitz established perpetual peace between sovereign states as equals, adopting European diplomatic norms. The territorial changes were devastating for Ottoman prestige. Hungary and Transylvania, which the Ottomans had controlled for over a century, were ceded to the Habsburg Empire. Podolia returned to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Peloponnese and Dalmatia went to Venice. Russia received Azov in a separate treaty the following year. But perhaps the treaty's most significant innovation was the border demarcation process. Contemporary diplomatic records document that joint commissions were established to physically map and mark the 850-kilometer border between Habsburg and Ottoman territories. Led by Italian engineer Luigi Ferdinando Marsigli, the commission placed stone cairns and created surveyed maps that legally and physically separated state territories. This cartographic effort pioneered modern international border management. Before Karlowitz, borders were often vague zones rather than precise lines. After Karlowitz, the European state system demanded exact territorial definition backed by scientific surveying. The psychological impact on the Ottoman Empire was profound. For 3 centuries, Ottoman sultans had viewed themselves as the rightful heirs to Rome, destined to expand until Christian Europe submitted. Karlowitz acknowledged that expansion was over. The empire was now in defensive mode, struggling to maintain what remained rather than conquering new territories. Contemporary Ottoman sources from the period document a crisis of confidence. How had God allowed the faithful to be defeated by infidels? What had the empire done to deserve divine abandonment? The answers Ottoman intellectuals and reformers proposed would shape the empire's trajectory for the next 2 centuries. But Vienna's impact extended beyond Ottoman borders. The victory established Habsburg dominance in Central Europe for over 200 years. The empire that had seemed on the verge of collapse in 1683 emerged as one of Europe's great powers, a position it would maintain until World War I. For Poland, the consequences were more ambiguous. Sobieski returned to Warsaw as the savior of Christendom, celebrated across Catholic Europe. But the military effort had strained Polish resources severely. The Commonwealth's internal political structure, which required noble consensus for major decisions, made it difficult to capitalize on Vienna's victory. Within decades, Poland would be weakened by internal divisions and external pressures that would eventually lead to its partition. The German imperial states used Vienna as evidence of collective strength. The Holy Roman Empire, often dismissed as politically fragmented, had demonstrated that coordinated action was possible. This coalition experience would influence German political development, showing that unity could be achieved when existential threats demanded it. The papacy gained significant prestige. Pope Innocent XI, who'd spent his personal fortune assembling the coalition, was vindicated. His diplomatic achievement in uniting Protestant and Catholic princes against a common enemy demonstrated the Church's continued relevance in European politics. Contemporary pamphlets and ballads celebrating Vienna's relief spread across Europe. In England, where the siege coincided with the exclusion crisis, both Whigs and Tories used Ottoman defeat as propaganda for domestic political struggles. Tory satirists compared Whig _quote _0 to Ottoman threat, while celebrating the victory as evidence of divine favor for monarchy. Visual media proliferated. Engravers like Gaspar Boutat's produced detailed bird's-eye views of the siege and battle, allowing literate Europeans to follow events with unprecedented immediacy. These engravings became bestsellers, displayed in homes and taverns across the continent. The cultural impact was equally significant. Vienna transformed from a besieged frontier city to a symbol of Christian resistance. The Reconstruction boom that followed saw Baroque architecture replace medieval structures. The imperial capital became a showcase of Habsburg power and Catholic artistic achievement. Coffee culture, whether or not directly traceable to captured Ottoman supplies, became permanently associated with Viennese identity. The coffee house as social institution, place for intellectual discussion and cultural exchange, emerged in post-siege Vienna and spread across Europe. But perhaps the deepest legacy was psychological. Vienna marked a turning point in European self-conception. For the first time in centuries, Christian Europe had definitively defeated Islamic expansion. The Ottoman threat that had loomed for generations suddenly seemed manageable, even reversible. This shift in confidence would shape European colonial expansion in subsequent centuries. The same military technologies and organizational methods that saved Vienna would be deployed globally as European powers projected force across the world. For the Ottoman Empire, Vienna marked the beginning of a long decline. The empire would survive another 2 centuries, but always on the defensive, always reacting to European pressure rather than initiating expansion. The siege that failed became a symbol of Ottoman limitation, the moment when divine favor seemed to shift from Istanbul to Vienna. Contemporary historians still debate whether Vienna was truly the turning point or merely the most dramatic example of broader trends already in motion. Ottoman administrative problems predated 1683. Habsburg military improvements had been developing for decades. The balance of power in Eastern Europe was shifting regardless of Vienna's outcome. But symbols matter in history, and Vienna became the symbol of Ottoman sunset and European ascendancy. For Kara Mustafa, defeat at Vienna was a death sentence. The only question was when and how. Ottoman chronicles document the Grand Vizier's flight south after the battle. He reached Belgrade in December 1683, attempting to reorganize remnant forces and salvage something from the disaster. But news of the defeat had reached Constantinople ahead of him. Sultan Mehmed IV faced enormous pressure. The largest Ottoman army ever assembled had been destroyed. The siege that was supposed to secure the Golden Apple had ended in humiliating rout. Vienna stood intact, while Ottoman prestige lay in ruins. Someone had to be blamed, and Kara Mustafa was the obvious target. Contemporary Ottoman administrative records document the Sultan's decision with bureaucratic precision. On December 25, 1683, exactly 3 months after the Vienna defeat, imperial executioners arrived at Kara Mustafa's residence in Belgrade. They carried the traditional instrument of Ottoman executions for high officials, the bowstring. Kara Mustafa knew what was coming. Ottoman protocol demanded that condemned viziers accept their fate without resistance. To struggle or attempt escape would dishonor one's family and could result in harsher punishment for relatives. Contemporary accounts describe Kara Mustafa meeting his executioners with resignation, understanding that this was the price of catastrophic failure. The execution was carried out by strangulation with a silk cord. This method was considered honorable for high officials, avoiding the spilling of blood while being relatively quick. Kara Mustafa died at approximately 50 years old. His ambitions literally choked out of him. His body was buried without ceremony in Belgrade. No grand tomb, no lasting memorial. The man who'd commanded over 100,000 troops and dreamed of conquering Vienna ended in an unmarked grave in a city he'd never planned to see. The execution served multiple purposes. It satisfied public demand for accountability. It allowed Sultan Mehmed to distance himself from the defeat. The failure was Kara Mustafa's alone, not the Ottoman system's. And it sent a clear message to other ambitious officials: failure on this scale would not be tolerated. But killing Kara Mustafa couldn't reverse Vienna's consequences. Ottoman sources from the following years document a period of recrimination and soul-searching. How had the empire's military machine failed so spectacularly? What reforms were necessary to prevent future disasters? Could Ottoman power be restored to its former glory? These questions would occupy Ottoman reformers for the next 2 centuries. Some blamed Kara Mustafa's personal failings: greed, stubbornness, tactical incompetence. Others saw systemic problems: administrative corruption, outdated military doctrine, failure to adapt to European technological advances. The truth likely combined both perspectives. Kara Mustafa's specific decisions, choosing siege over assault, refusing to abandon the siege when relief approached, dividing forces between siege and field battle, all contributed to defeat. But these errors occurred within a system that had weaknesses deeper than any single commander's failures. Contemporary Ottoman military analysis identified several critical problems. The Janissaries, once the empire's elite fighting force, had become a politically powerful class more interested in trade and urban politics than military effectiveness. The Sipahi system, which relied on feudal landholders providing cavalry in exchange for land grants, was breaking down as population pressures and administrative changes eroded the Timar system. Artillery and fortification technology had advanced in Europe while Ottoman methods stagnated. Most fundamentally, the balance of military power was shifting. European states were developing professional standing armies, standardized training, and bureaucratic systems that could maintain force readiness year-round. The Ottoman system, which relied on mobilizing forces for specific campaigns, then demobilizing, was becoming less competitive. Yet for all these systemic problems, the execution of Kara Mustafa meant the Ottoman Empire avoided honest reckoning with its failures. Blaming one man was easier than reforming an entire military and administrative system. The institutional changes necessary to compete with European powers were recognized but not implemented. Historical counterfactuals are always speculative, but it's worth considering what might have happened if Kara Mustafa had succeeded. A Vienna in Ottoman hands would have opened Germany to invasion. The Habsburg Empire might have collapsed, fragmenting Central Europe into smaller states unable to resist Ottoman pressure. Polish independence could have been threatened. The entire balance of power that would shape the next 2 centuries might have shifted dramatically. Instead, Kara Mustafa's failure ensured European ascendancy. His execution symbolized the end of Ottoman expansion and the beginning of long retreat. One man's ambition and incompetence had changed history's trajectory. By the time Kara Mustafa died in Belgrade, Vienna was already rebuilding. The walls he'd spent 60 days trying to breach were being repaired. The city he'd hoped to plunder was being transformed into a Baroque showcase. And the empire he'd hoped to glorify was beginning its slow decline toward eventual dissolution. The bowstring that ended his life marked the end of an era. 15,000 defenders, 60 days of starvation, disease, and siege, 100,000 Ottoman troops, and 12 hours of combat that reversed 300 years of history. The numbers still stagger. Contemporary sources document casualty ratios that seem impossible. Ottoman losses at Vienna and in the immediate pursuit. Estimates ranging from 20,000 to 50,000 killed or captured. Coalition casualties, approximately 4,000 dead and wounded across the entire battle. The disparity wasn't just victory, but annihilation. Vienna didn't just survive. It became a symbol. The city that should have fallen according to every military calculation of the era held long enough for relief to arrive. Starhemberg's garrison, reduced to 1/3 strength by disease and starvation, maintained discipline when collapse seemed inevitable. And Sobieski's cavalry, the winged hussars, who represented a century of Polish martial tradition, delivered the decisive blow that modern military historians still study. The consequences echoed across centuries. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 marked the first time the Ottoman Empire negotiated as a defeated equal rather than a dominant power granting truces. Hungary remained Austrian rather than Ottoman, preserving Central Europe's Christian character and preventing Islamic expansion into Germany. The power balance that shaped the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and eventually both world wars was determined in part by those 12 hours in September 1683. But the legacy is more than geopolitical. Vienna demonstrated that coalitions could function despite religious and political divisions. Protestant and Catholic princes who'd slaughtered each other in the 30 Years' War fought together at Vienna, proving that existential threats could overcome even theological hatred. This coalition model would influence European diplomacy for centuries. The battle also marked a technological and tactical turning point. The Tres Italienne fortifications that Starhemberg defended showed the continued effectiveness of properly designed bastions against even the best siege engineering. Polish shock cavalry tactics achieved their apotheosis in Sobieski's charge. The largest and most successful implementation of heavy cavalry doctrine in European history, and the Ottoman defeat demonstrated that traditional Eastern military methods were increasingly outmatched by European professionalization. Contemporary observers understood Vienna's significance immediately. The pamphlets, ballads, and engravings that flooded Europe in the siege's aftermath celebrated not just a military victory, but a cultural and religious triumph. Vienna became shorthand for Christian civilization's survival against Islamic expansion. Modern historians debate whether this religious framing oversimplifies more complex political and military realities. But the perception shaped European identity formation regardless of historical nuance. The idea of quote one as a distinct civilization defending itself against quote two was powerfully reinforced by Vienna's symbolism. Visit Vienna today and the battlefield is gone. The glacis, where Starhemberg's defenders held, became the Ringstrasse, the circular boulevard lined with 19th century buildings. The bastions were demolished in urban expansion. The Vienna woods, where Sobieski's army descended, are now parks and suburbs, but remnants survive. The Kahlenberg summit still offers views across Vienna. The Augustinian church contains battle standards captured from the Ottomans. The Heeresgeschichtliches Museum preserves armor, weapons, and artifacts from the siege. And beneath modern streets, archaeological excavations occasionally uncover evidence of the underground war. Collapsed tunnels, Ottoman mines, Habsburg countermines. The Turkish siege monuments, scattered throughout Vienna, mark the Ottoman positions. But they're less memorials to enemies than reminders of how close Central Europe came to a fundamentally different fate. Perhaps the most poignant legacy is the annual Mass celebrated at the Kahlenberg Church on September 12th. The tradition, maintained since 1683, commemorates the battle and gives thanks for Vienna's deliverance. It's a reminder that for the people who lived through the siege, this wasn't abstract history, but survival against impossible odds. The siege taught lessons that remain relevant. Superior numbers don't guarantee victory if leadership is flawed. Time can be a weapon. Every day Vienna held was another day for relief to organize. Coalitions require more than shared enemies. They need diplomatic skill to maintain unity. And sometimes, against all probability, the desperate defense succeeds. Starhemberg never received the recognition he deserved. His methodical defense, the decisions that preserved Vienna long enough for Sobieski to arrive, were overshadowed by the dramatic relief and cavalry charge. Yet without those 60 days of disciplined resistance, no relief army would have mattered. Sobieski returned to Poland celebrated as Christendom's savior. But his commonwealth would be partitioned within a century, destroyed by the same internal political divisions that made Vienna's relief such a remarkable achievement. His personal triumph couldn't save Poland from its systemic weaknesses. The Ottoman Empire survived Vienna's defeat, but never recovered its expansionist momentum. The long retreat had begun, a decline that would take centuries, but was fundamentally shaped by that September defeat. Kara Mustafa's strangled corpse in Belgrade symbolized the empire's lost future. For the Habsburgs, Vienna's survival meant another 200 years of Central European dominance. The empire that should have died in 1683 instead emerged as a great power that would shape European history until World War I. Standing on the walls that hold, where 15,000 once faced 100,000, where Starhemberg's garrison refused to break, where the fate of civilizations hung on human endurance, you can still feel history's weight. These stones held. The gates didn't open. And Europe as we know it survived, because desperate men decided that survival was worth 60 days of hell. The Turkish siege of Vienna failed, but only just. And that narrow margin, measured in days of starvation and hours of cavalry charges, made all the difference.